There are moments that split your life into a before and after. A clean fracture where everything you thought was solid breaks apart, and you're left standing in the rubble trying to figure out what to carry forward. Mine happened on a Tuesday evening in October, when I was 18 years old. Sitting on the front step of the house I'd grown up in with 2 black garbage bags on either side of me and nowhere on earth to go. I had told my mother that afternoon that I was pregnant. She didn't scream or cry or pull me into her arms. She went very still, the way she always did before she said something that couldn't be taken back, and then she told me I had 2 hours to take whatever I could carry and get out. She said I had made my choices and I could figure out the consequences alone. By the time I'd filled those 2 garbage bags with clothes and a few books and the stuffed rabbit I'd had since I was 7, she had already called a locksmith. I heard the deadbolt clicking into its new configuration from the front step and understood with a terrible clarity that I was no longer her daughter. I was a problem she had solved. What I remember most about that evening isn't the cold or the weight of the bags or even the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking. What I remember is how ordinary everything looked. The neighbor's porch light was on. Someone was mowing their lawn 2 houses down. The sky was that particular shade of October pink that usually made me feel peaceful, and I sat in the middle of all that normalcy and understood for the first time what it meant to be completely, catastrophically alone. Lily's father was a one-night thing during freshman orientation at college, a few weeks before my world collapsed. He was visiting from Switzerland, someone's cousin or friend of a friend. I hadn't been paying much attention to logistics. I knew his first name was Nicholas. I knew he had a warm laugh and quoted European literature, and that we'd stayed up until 4 in the morning talking about things that felt important at 18. I didn't have his number. I didn't know his last name. I didn't know what school he attended or what city he'd flown back to. After that night, he simply ceased to exist as a real person in my life and became instead the cause of everything that followed. I dropped out of college 3 weeks after finding out I was pregnant. I moved into a women's shelter on the east side of the city, a place with buzzing fluorescent lights and a waiting list for beds and a shared bathroom that smelled of bleach and exhaustion. Carol, my mother, told everyone who asked that I had run off to Las Vegas to be a stripper. She said it with just enough sadness in her voice that people believed her, that they sent her sympathetic texts and brought her casseroles, and nobody once thought to check whether her 18-year-old daughter was sleeping in a shelter. My sister Sophia knew the truth. She would meet me at parks when she could manage it, sitting on benches while Lily played on the equipment, pressing folded 20s into my hand and bags of second-hand baby clothes into my arms. She did it in secret, terrified that Carol would find out and cut off her college tuition. I never blamed Sophia for that fear. Our mother had used financial control as a weapon for as long as either of us could remember, and Sophia had learned, as I had, that the cost of disobedience was high and came without warning. I gave birth to Lily alone in a county hospital on a Thursday morning in June, listed on the intake forms as indigent, with no one in the waiting room and no one to call. A nurse named Deborah held my hand during the last hour and told me I was doing great, and I have never forgotten her face or her name. Lily weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and looked up at me from the delivery table with an expression of profound suspicion, as though she already understood that this world was going to require a great deal of her, and she wasn't yet sure she was willing to cooperate. I brought her home to a shelter room with a donated bassinet and a 6-week stack of diapers from WIC and figured out, as I had figured out everything else in those first months, by necessity. The 5 years that followed were the kind of years that don't make for a good story because there is no arc to grinding poverty. No satisfying narrative structure to the daily calculation of which bill you skip and which meal you stretch and whether you can afford bus fare or whether you'll walk the 4 miles to the diner in the dark. I waitressed. I endured customers who thought my tip depended on their access to my body. I moved us into a studio apartment with black mold behind the drywall and roaches, that appeared every night around midnight regardless of how clean I kept the kitchen. Lily slept in a dresser drawer lined with folded blankets until I saved enough for a second-hand crib. I got my GED through an online program during Lily's nap times, studying with my laptop balanced on the bathroom counter because the kitchen table was covered in drying formula bottles. I started community college when she turned 3, taking 2 classes per semester and arranging my schedule around her daycare hours. She was brilliant from the beginning, the kind of child who asked questions you couldn't answer and remembered everything you said and would correct you gently if you got a fact wrong. She started reading at 4. She could do basic arithmetic before kindergarten. She made me feel, on the hardest days, that whatever I was doing must be working. My mother lived 20 minutes away and never called. I was working the dinner shift at the restaurant on a Wednesday night in March, 5 years and 4 months after Carol had changed the locks, when a man in an expensive suit sat down at one of my tables and stared at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read, not unkind, but searching. Like someone trying to place a face from a photograph. He ordered sparkling water and the salmon and kept looking at me in that unsettling, focused way until I finally stopped beside his table and asked if something was wrong. He asked, in accented English, if I had attended State University approximately 5 years ago. My heart stopped in a way that wasn't metaphorical. I genuinely felt it seize, then restart. His name was Nicholas Morty. He was 31 years old, the eldest son of a family that owned a chain of luxury hotels across Western Europe, and he had spent the last 2 years and a considerable amount of money trying to find me. His cousin had come across a photo in the university's orientation archive, a group shot I'd barely remembered being in, and recognized the girl Nicholas had mentioned once or twice in unguarded moments. The American who'd quoted Shakespeare while slightly drunk and laughed at his terrible jokes about Swiss punctuality. He had hired investigators. He had searched every social media platform. He had, he told me quietly, never quite managed to stop thinking about the night we'd spent talking until sunrise, and had always assumed, hoped, really, that finding me would be straightforward. It had not been. I stood beside his table in my work apron and told him about Lily. He cried in front of me without any apparent embarrassment about it, tears sliding down the kind of face that was probably not accustomed to crying in public restaurants. And I watched him and felt something shift and reconfigure inside me. Not love, not yet. Not anything so simple, but a recognition that this was the axis point, the before and after of a whole new chapter I hadn't known was coming. He asked to meet her immediately. I said not yet, that we needed to slow down, that there was a small person whose feelings mattered more than either of our timelines, and he nodded and said he understood, even though I could see it cost him something to say it. Within a week, with the formal processes still pending, he had arranged a meeting with a family lawyer. Within 2 weeks, he had insisted on placing funds into an escrow account designated for Lily's care, retroactive to her birth, $10,000 per month for 60 months, held until paternity could be legally confirmed. He arranged for the house I'd been renting to be purchased and placed in my name with legal protections. I didn't fully understand yet, but that Rachel Green, the attorney Nicholas had hired specifically to represent my interests rather than his, walked me through with patient thoroughness over 2 hours in her downtown office. Rachel was in her mid-30s, precise and undramatic, with a wall of law degrees and an ability to explain complicated documents in ordinary language that made me feel, for the first time in years, like someone was actually on my side. She told me she worked for me alone, paid by Nicholas, but answerable only to what I wanted and needed. I signed things until my hand cramped and felt, with each signature, the particular relief of a structure being built around us. That was the week Carol came back. She arrived at my new house on a Saturday afternoon with flowers, yellow tulips, which had always been my favorite, a detail she hadn't forgotten, which made it worse somehow, and tears already assembled in her eyes. and a prepared speech about second chances and family, and how young she'd been when everything happened, as if we'd both simply made understandable mistakes during a difficult time. I let her in. I don't know exactly why, except that part of me had spent 5 years rehearsing this conversation and wanted to finally have it. She talked for a long time. She talked about missing us, about regret, about how families needed to forgive each other, about how she'd thought about me every day even when she'd been too proud to call. She talked in the way people talk when they are performing contrition rather than actually feeling it, the right words in roughly the right order, but with a rhythm that felt rehearsed. And then she saw a photograph on the bookshelf, Lily at a Swiss estate surrounded by Nicholas's family, all of them laughing and sunlit and expensive-looking, and her eyes changed in a way I recognized. She suggested we plan Lily's 6th birthday together. In Switzerland, maybe. She'd always wanted to see Geneva. Nicholas walked in from the kitchen at that precise moment. He had heard most of it. My mother turned toward him and did what she always did when she encountered someone she wanted something from. She smiled and extended her hand and became the warmest version of herself, gushing about her precious granddaughter and what a wonderful thing it was that family had found its way back together. Nicholas looked at her outstretched hand, the way you might look at something you'd discovered on the underside of a rock. "You're the woman who threw out your pregnant daughter," he said, not as a question. Carol began to explain herself, tough love, teaching responsibility, not knowing how bad things had gotten, and Nicholas took out his phone with the unhurried calm of someone who had prepared for this exact conversation. He showed her the shelter intake form with my name at the top and a red checkbox beside the words abandoned minor. He showed her the social services emergency housing application, time-stamped at 8 months pregnant. He showed her the county hospital record listing my status as indigent, with no emergency contact filled in. He asked, in the same quiet voice, whether she would like him to continue through the remaining 5 years of documentation his investigators had compiled. Carol's makeup began to run. She pivoted hard toward me, hands reaching, voice cracking, saying she'd been so scared herself, she'd made a terrible mistake, she'd thought about me every day. I stepped back before her hands could reach me. My voice was steadier than I expected when I told her she needed to leave. Nicholas moved beside me without a word, and I walked to the front door and held it open. And after a long moment in which my mother seemed to genuinely not believe this was happening, she gathered her tulips and her purse and walked past me with her head down. I watched her car pull away from the curb and then leaned against the closed door while my legs went unreliable beneath me. Nicholas and I sat at the kitchen table after I'd checked that Lily was still asleep upstairs, her nightlight casting a soft stripe of gold under the door. He apologized for confronting Carol without warning me first, explaining that when he'd hired investigators to find me, they'd assembled a complete picture of those 5 years as part of their search, not to use as ammunition, but because the documentation existed and he'd thought, in the abstract, that I might someday need it. He hadn't planned to produce it. He'd heard her voice from the kitchen and made a decision. I told him I wasn't angry. I wasn't sure what I was exactly, but it wasn't angry. The DNA test happened on a Monday morning at a medical facility downtown, with chain-of-custody documentation and a technician in blue scrubs who explained each step with the particular patience of someone who had done this many times for families in complicated situations. Lily giggled when the swab touched her cheek and asked if they were checking for cavities like at the dentist. Nicholas said it was something similar, and I watched him hold her gaze with complete attention and thought that whatever else he was not someone who talked down to children. She skipped to the car talking about how the stick had tickled. Nicholas and I exchanged a look that said we were both relieved it was done. The results arrived 3 weeks later by courier. In an official envelope with laboratory seals, I didn't know how to interpret until I turned to the last page, which said what we already knew in the precise, unsentimental language of science. That evening, we sat with Lily on the couch and Nicholas, told her simply that he was her daddy, that he had been looking for us for a very long time, and that he hadn't known about her before, but now he did and wanted to be part of her life. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most important questions, and then asked whether Switzerland had McDonald's. Nicholas said yes, but the menu was in French and German. Lily found this deeply interesting and went back to her coloring. Rachel had connected me with her colleague Dr. Karen Walsh, a child therapist who specialized in family transitions, and Dr. Walsh became one of the most important people in those early months. She was measured and unhurried, with an office full of art supplies and dollhouse figures, and she created a space where Lily could process what was happening without any of the adults in her life hovering over her reactions. At Lily's second session, Dr. Walsh asked her to draw a picture of her family and her feelings. Lily drew herself in the middle of the page with a thought bubble above her head full of question marks. When asked what she was wondering about, she said she was scared her daddy would go away again, even though she knew it wasn't his fault he hadn't known about her. Hearing her name the fear out loud was, I think, the moment I understood how resilient she actually was. Not untouched, she was carrying this, feeling it, working through it in her own 5-year-old way, but capable of articulating it instead of just absorbing it silently. That was more than I had managed at twice her age. Dr. Walsh gave us specific scripts for talking about hard topics, and one Saturday Nicholas and Lily sat at the kitchen table with a blank monthly calendar and 2 sheets of stickers, purple hearts for video call days, gold stars for in-person visits. Lily placed them with the grave precision of someone making an important decision, slightly crooked and overlapping, her tongue pressed to her upper lip in concentration. When we taped the calendar to her bedroom wall, she stood back and admired it and asked if she could add more stickers for her birthday. Nicholas handed her the entire sheet without hesitation. The legal architecture took several weeks to complete. Rachel and Nicholas's attorney worked through a formal co-parenting plan that laid out everything in the kind of specific language that leaves no room for misunderstanding. Alternating weekend visits with Wednesday evening video calls. Financial support flowing through a structured account with full documentation. Major decisions about Lily's education and healthcare requiring mutual agreement. We signed it at Rachel's conference table one morning in late April, both of us a little solemn, and Rachel filed it with the court that afternoon. Having it on the official record felt like installing a foundation under something that had been floating. I met with a financial advisor Rachel recommended, a woman who worked specifically with people navigating sudden changes in financial circumstances, and she helped me understand what the escrow money actually was. Not a windfall, not a reward, but deferred child support. Money that belonged to Lily's future, and how to manage it responsibly. We talked about community college and long-term savings, and the difference between financial security and financial stability. And I left her office with a written plan and the particular sensation of being taken seriously by a professional in a way I hadn't experienced very often. I also enrolled in spring classes at the community college I'd been attending, business fundamentals, English composition, introductory accounting. The schedule aligned with Lily's school hours and Nicholas's visit days. I could afford the textbooks. I could afford to study instead of working double shifts. Sitting at my kitchen table with the acceptance letter, I thought about how many years I'd been moving toward this specific moment, and how different it felt to arrive at it without the weight of desperation sitting on my chest. Carol, meanwhile, was making her own slow way through the consequences of her choices. The lawyers sent her a formal letter establishing a no-contact boundary after she showed up at Lily's school, asking the front office about pickup procedures. I had filled out the restriction paperwork right there in the administrator's office, my hands shaking with the specific anger of a mother who has discovered her child's school was used as a pressure point. Signing the no-contact letter made me feel sick with guilt and also, unexpectedly, powerful, as if choosing safety over keeping the peace was something I was only now understanding I was allowed to do. My mother's response was a 5-page handwritten letter, delivered by post, that mixed genuine apology language with implicit conditions, listed all the places she wanted to take Lily, and suggested we plan a family trip to Switzerland together. And managed to imply in every other paragraph that I had already forgiven her, and we just needed to work out the logistics of being a happy family again. I read it twice, recognized the architecture of manipulation that had structured my entire childhood, and placed it in a documentation folder alongside every voicemail, text, and incident I'd been recording at Rachel's suggestion. Diana Cole, the family mediator Rachel connected us with, ran the first formal session with my mother on a gray Thursday morning in a neutral downtown office. Carol arrived on time in a nice dress with tissues in her purse and cried almost immediately, and then began qualifying her apology with explanations about tough love and her own fear, and how she genuinely believed I would figure it out. Diana stopped her and explained that the exercise required acknowledgement without justification. Carol struggled with that. She wanted, very badly, to explain herself, and I understood this impulse because I had spent a long time wanting to explain myself to people who weren't listening. But I sat there and named each thing out loud: the 2 hours' notice, the changed locks, the 5 years of silence, the lies she told at family gatherings, the hospital where I'd given birth alone while she lived 20 minutes away, and asked her to confirm that she remembered each one. She did confirm them, eventually, between sobs. Diana assigned her the homework of writing them down without justification and scheduled a follow-up for 2 weeks later. At the follow-up session, my mother arrived with 3 handwritten pages and read them aloud in a voice that shook but didn't stop. She listed specific actions, specific moments, specific choices. She described getting the call from Sophia that I had given birth alone and choosing not to go to the hospital. She described seeing Lily's photograph for the first time 2 years later and feeling nothing because she had convinced herself I deserved whatever happened to me. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard her say, and I sat with it for a long moment before I spoke. I told her I heard what she had said. I didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't. I didn't tell her I forgave her, because I wasn't there yet. I told her I accepted what she'd read as a first step, and that she would need to keep demonstrating change through actions over time. We negotiated the terms of limited contact. No unsupervised time with Lily for at least 6 months, no overnight visits indefinitely, a review every 3 months based on Lily's well-being, and whether Carol kept attending weekly therapy with documented proof. Doctor. Walsh had given me specific criteria, sustained change measured in months, not apologies, and I held to those criteria with the steadiness of someone who had learned, at considerable cost, that boundaries without consequences are just suggestions. Carol agreed to every condition, without arguing for more. The first supervised visit happened on a Wednesday afternoon at a family center downtown. I sat in the waiting area with a book I couldn't focus on while a staff member monitored the session. Coloring books and crayons, no gifts, no promises, no asking Lily to keep secrets. After an hour, Lily came out holding a butterfly she'd colored in orange and purple, and my mother followed at an appropriate distance and left through the side exit without trying to hug Lily goodbye. In the car, I didn't push Lily to talk. When we got home and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her snack, I asked gently how she'd felt about seeing her grandmother. She said Grandma seemed nice, but also sad, and that they'd colored together and talked about favorite animals. She wasn't sure if she wanted to see her again soon. Maybe in a while, but not next week. I told her that was completely okay, that she got to decide the pace and no one would force anything. She nodded and asked for more crackers, and I gave them to her and felt something in my chest that I recognized after a moment as ordinary Tuesday afternoon peace. Lily's birthday party happened on a sunny Saturday morning at the park near our apartment. Nicholas arrived early and helped me hang streamers from the pavilion posts. He had done his homework at the dollar store and come back with purple and gold, Lily's current favorite color combination, selected with the seriousness of someone who had been given an important assignment. The kids arrived in a wave of noise and wrapping paper, and Lily ran between them with her hair flying, getting hiccups from laughing too hard during the relay races. We brought out the grocery store sheet cake with its slightly uneven frosting and 6 candles, and everyone sang while Lily pressed her palms to her cheeks and glowed, and she blew out all 6 in one breath, and then asked for the piece with the biggest frosting flower. Carol arrived at 11 for the 30-minute window she'd been allotted, standing at the edge of the pavilion without gifts, watching from a careful distance. She smiled when Lily waved at her between games. When her time was up, she said a quiet goodbye and walked back to her car, leaving exactly when she was supposed to, without drama, without pushing for one more minute. I watched her go and felt something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first tentative possibility of it. The sense that if she kept doing this, kept showing up on time, kept following the rules, kept choosing consistency over performance, there might be something worth building on the far side of all this careful reconstruction. Nicholas's father called him every other week with suggestions about settling down, about how I might be an acceptable match given Lily's existence, about how a formal arrangement would make everything cleaner. Nicholas told me about these calls with the directness I had come to appreciate about him, adding quickly that he had told his father, each time, that this was not a conversation he was willing to have. That we needed to build stable co-parenting first, and that he had no intention of treating a relationship with me as a logical solution to a family optics problem. We sat with our coffee and agreed that some things were more important than neat endings, and that Lily's security was the most important of all of them. It felt like an adult conversation, the kind I hadn't known I was capable of having until I'd spent a year learning to hold my own. Sophia and I started meeting for coffee every other week at a sandwich place across town, where neither of us would run into people we knew. She looked different over those months, lighter, somehow, as if something that had been pressing down on her from above had gradually lifted. She told me she had set a limit with Carol. She wouldn't listen to complaints about me anymore, and if Carol wanted to discuss me, she could take it to her therapist. Carol had pushed back at first, then stopped. Their conversations were shorter and less toxic, Sophia said, and she was beginning to understand that you could love a difficult parent and still refuse to carry their weight for them. We talked about being sisters without our mother in the middle of us, and it turned out we had quite a lot to say. Nicholas left for Switzerland on a Tuesday morning, and Lily stood at the window with her palm pressed against the glass, watching his car disappear. We had set up the video call schedule before he left, specific times marked on the wall calendar with the stickers she'd chosen herself, and that first call happened at bedtime, with Lily holding her tablet and walking him through her bedroom, pointing at each toy and telling him its name and backstory. He listened with complete attention and asked questions that proved he'd been paying attention to everything she'd said. When we hung up, she counted the days until his next visit using the sticker chart, her finger moving from square to square with focused concentration. 14 days, she said. That's right, I said. She seemed satisfied with this, with the fact of the number, with the knowledge that the distance was measurable and therefore manageable. I tucked her in, and she was asleep before I reached the door. I drove past our old apartment building one afternoon on my way home from class. I'm not entirely sure why. Some instinct toward reckoning, maybe, or just the proximity of the route. I parked across the street and sat with the engine running. The paint was still peeling off the front door. The parking lot still had the same potholes, still held the same thin layer of oily water that never quite drained. I sat there and let the memories surface without trying to manage them. The smell of mildew that no amount of bleach touched, Lily crying from hunger while I waited for my paycheck to clear, counting coins on the kitchen counter to see if we had enough for the laundromat. I stayed for 10 minutes. I did not get out of the car. I drove home to our safe apartment, working heat, no roaches, Lily's drawings on the refrigerator and her purple sneakers by the door. And I thought, as I sometimes did in quiet moments, about the distance between those two places. Not just the physical distance, but the distance of what it had cost to travel it. The calculation is always still there in the back of my mind, the instinct that made me read every legal document twice and ask for every agreement in writing and maintain the documentation folder even when things were going smoothly. That wasn't paranoia. That was knowledge I had earned. And I had no intention of putting it down. Months passed. Carol kept going to therapy every week and sent me the attendance confirmations as required. She showed up on time for supervised visits and followed the rules without pushing for more access. She didn't call Sophia to complain about me anymore, or at least Sophia stopped hearing it. The lack of drama continued to surprise me more than its presence had, because I had spent so long bracing for the next thing she would do. Dr. Walsh told me, at a check-in session, that the most important indicator of change wasn't the apologies, but the accumulation of small, consistent choices made without an audience. Carol was making those choices. Slowly, imperfectly, in a way I was not yet ready to call transformation, but that I was willing to acknowledge as genuine effort. Lily started first grade in September. She came home on the third day and informed me that her teacher had asked the class to draw their families, and she had drawn me, Nicholas, and herself in a park, with a small figure at the edge of the page that she identified as her grandmother. She had given the grandmother figure yellow flowers because, she said, Grandma liked flowers. "Is that okay?" she asked, looking up at me with the particular expression she used when she was pretty sure something was okay but wanted confirmation. "That's perfect," I said. She went back to her drawing with the settled satisfaction of someone who had asked a reasonable question and received a reasonable answer, and I sat at the kitchen table for a long moment after she went back to her room, thinking about the difference between the story I had survived and the one we were in the middle of building. It was not a fairy tale. It was something more complicated and more durable than that, a structure assembled carefully from the materials available, reinforced at every point of weakness, checked regularly for integrity. Everyone in it was still learning their role. Nobody had all the answers. But the ground was solid, and Lily was 6 years old and happy, and I was 24 and finally, genuinely, starting to understand what it felt like to have a future instead of just the ongoing emergency of the present. That felt like enough. More than enough, actually. It felt like the beginning of something real.